Hello and welcome to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm Gabriel Sanders, public programs producer at the museum. And thank you for being here with us for a conversation about The American Way, a true story of Nazi escape, Superman, and Marilyn Monroe, with Bonnie Siegler, Helene Stupinski, and moderated by Bob Morris. We at the museum are committed to our crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, resistance against injustice, and more. We hope you will spend time here at the museum and visit our exhibitions, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust, photographs by Martin Scholler, and The Garden of Stones by Andy Goldsworthy. We are looking forward to this fall when we will open Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, our first exhibition for visitors elementary aged and older about the incredible story of the Danish rescue. Our work is supported essentially by your donations and membership. Museum members enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission to our galleries. Learn more at mjhnyc.org/join. Copies of The American Way are available for purchase after the event at our visitor services desk in the main lobby, and Bonnie and Helene will stay for a signing. To focus on the full scope of the conversation they're going to have, we are not going to open it up to audience Q&A. I would like to now ask everyone to silence their cell phones. Thank you again for joining us, and I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Bonnie Siegler is the founder and creative director of award-winning multidisciplinary graphic design studio 8½. The author of Dear Client, a guide for people who work with creatives, and Signs of Resistance, a history of protest in America. She taught design in the graduate schools of Yale University and the School of Visual Arts for many years. Helene Stupinski is the nationally best-selling author of 3 memoirs, Five Finger Discount, Murder in Matera, and Baby Plays Around. She writes regularly for the New York Times, and her work has appeared in the Washington Post, New York, Travel and Leisure, and dozens of other publications. She teaches at NYU. Bob Morris is a frequent New York Times contributor and the author of Assisted Loving, Bobby Wonderful, and Crispin the Terrible. His plays have been produced off-Broadway and regionally, including at the Jewish Rep, MCC, and Capitol Rep. He is working on a book about singing. Please welcome Bonnie Siegler, Helene Stupinski, and Bob Morris.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you. Thanks.
Good evening. I will say that we do have slides, and I kind of talked Bonnie into having a conversation and having the slides all at the same time. The reason is that the images are fabulous because we know that Bonnie is a fabulous graphic designer. So we'll see how it goes. If it's a little distracting, bear with us. And that's kind of how I wanted to get you guided along here. So I was telling you too that I was in the Holocaust Museum of St. Petersburg, Florida, just the other day, and I walk in, and as it is often the case in Florida, the docent there was all over me as soon as I walk in the door. And she's making this introduction, and I'm detecting a very strong Caribbean accent. So I did something that's probably not politically correct, but I asked her where she was from. I asked if she was from Cuba. She said, no, I am from Puerto Rico. I said, oh, so you're a Jewish woman from Puerto Rico? She says, no, I'm not Jewish. And I said, well, you're in the Holocaust Museum. Why are you spending your time as a volunteer in this museum? And she looks at me and she says, you know, I really love the stories of survival and how people thrive. I find it very inspirational. So that is sort of what tonight and this book is all about. And so kind of the first thing that I was kind of wondering, is it possible to have a feel-good book about the Holocaust?
The answer is yes.
This is it. This is it.
Keep the mics up when you're talking.
Even when I'm laughing. Yeah, I think, as we started researching it and we started to delve into the family background and found out exactly what happened to the people that Jules, the main character, left behind in Berlin, we realized the Holocaust had to play a much bigger role than what we originally intended, and so the sort of middle of the book is a lot about what happened to these people, but it's wrapped in Marilyn and Superman.
The American way.
Yeah.
So we'll get to that. Yeah. And the first thing order of business in this Seder is for you to give the audience a little sample of the book.
You want to go?
And I will set it up to say that this is right at the beginning of the book, and we're on the Upper East Side in the 1950s, and it's a brisk night, and Bonnie's grandfather, Jules, is walking towards an area lit up almost like Yankee Stadium.
Okay. Then the movie director flitted past in his fedora, nervously eyeing the growing throng. His name was Billy Wilder. They were both from Berlin, Jules knew, both escaped Jewish refugees. He caught Wilder's eye and held it for a moment, long enough to think that maybe Billy, too, knew what they had in common, as if Jules was somehow marked with invisible ink that only the fellow wounded could detect. Billy walked past, and Jules was suddenly reminded of his purpose here tonight. He squeezed his black box between his legs, screwed around with a few knobs, wound a small crank, knelt down into a narrow, free space between bodies, and then placed the box up to his right eye, his Bolex 16mm camera.
It was September 15th, 1954, and it was no accident that Jules was here. He was a thoughtful man who had always planned everything very carefully. Befriending that gaffer was just one of many steps that brought this furrier and amateur filmmaker to the front row of one of the most iconic moments in 20th century film history, one that he and he alone would save for posterity in living, moving color. Jules looked around the artificially lit New York City street corner. Always so much life, so much to capture. He had tasted the bitterness of life, but this was the sweet part. He peeked through the lens of his Bolex, focused on Billy Wilder and the crew in front of him. And suddenly, as if she knew he was coming, out stepped Marilyn Monroe. And action. You're up.
So these are just a few stills from the film. You can see edges of people and of the, what are the things on the lights, those gates on the lights in almost every shot. And this is what the film looked like, so when we first found it.
Wait a minute, just a minute. Let's get to the story. We have to assume these people don't know anything.
Sorry, I apologize.
So tell me how the article that inspired the book came about.
Okay. So this started in the New York Times. After Trump was elected, I was very upset. And I was trying to figure out what I could possibly do to help, what could I talk about, what could I design, anything. And you know, Trump introduced this kind of hate that we hadn't seen in a long time, and that's the part that scared me, because when people start to hate, they usually hate Jews first. And I really felt a little frightened. So I knew my grandfather's Holocaust story was phenomenal, and his survival was amazing. And I thought maybe if we got an article about him in the New York Times and told his story and just started talking about the Holocaust, just reminding people, and I had this beautiful woman that I could lead the story with in Marilyn Monroe. So I asked my book agent, actually, if she knew a good writer that I could talk to about doing this article in the Times. And she just said, yep, I know the perfect person. And then I met Helene.
And we should say that there was a myth in your family about this footage.
Well, we knew, he talked about it a lot, so we knew he had gone out and shot Marilyn Monroe. He just talked about it very casually, bragged about it. And we believed him. We didn't have any reason not to believe him, but we hadn't ever seen the film. And then when he was moving, we were cleaning out his closets and everything, and we found in a plastic bag just a jumble of loose film, and it was in there. And so that thing is, when we held it up to the light, we knew instantly it was the Marilyn footage, because you can see it so clearly.
So the story appeared, and it was very, very popular, and Helene obviously did a great job with it, but my question to you was, you get pitched all the time as a New York Times contributor. What attracted you to delve in and then to really go after a book without even a contract? I mean, you spent months in research.
Well, when I first heard the story that, you know, she had found this footage, but that her grandfather had escaped from Nazi Germany, you know, all the bells and whistles go off in my brain. I'm just like, Marilyn Monroe is enough. But, you know, we've got this guy who's got this incredible story about his escape from Nazi Germany. And I just knew the basics. I didn't really know that much about it, but I had lunch with Bonnie. And, you know, we hit it off immediately. We just completely bonded at that first lunch. And she showed me the footage on her phone. And then she started to tell me his story. And it's just an incredible story. And I know a good story. That's one of my gifts, is I know a good story. That's why I'm successful. You know,
right,
I know the good story. I
you're
pitch the good ones, only the good ones. You get 1,000 pitches a day, and you have to tell people, go away, you know. And Bonnie, I invited over to stay with me for 2 years.
I want to say something, because you neglected to tell everybody that you have done 2 family memoirs digging into the research of your fakakta families in both situations.
Right.
So, what about that and how this came to the table? I mean,
well, I basically had used all the information from my family. I was dry. I had nothing left.
There was a murder in Sicily, right? Or somewhere
no, not Sicily, southern Italy, but
in southern Italy. That was one.
Yeah.
And what was the other one? Like,
the first one was about the criminals in my family here in Jersey City. So everyone in my family, you know, was tormented by me over the years. Anyway, but that I was done with that. I ran out of material, basically, and here comes Bonnie.
She ran out of material, so here comes this one.
And how lucky am I that Helene ran out of gangsters?
When they read the book, they will decide that you were both, I think, very lucky with the story, which I found to be a very compelling page turner and, you know, a quick, fun read.
I had never, over the first weeks and months that Helene and I got to know each other, every day I'd call her, wait, I remembered something else, I have another story, and I had never put them all together because, you know, it's just family stories. So it was really exciting how excited she was to hear all of them.
I mean, maybe by the end of the night you'll have ideas, if you have family stories brewing, how to enter that process. But meanwhile, we're going to go back now to the center of the book, your grandpa, Opie, Jules. a successful Berlin furrier with a very cute, posh life that sort of had chords of what, some of us saw in Leopoldstadt on Broadway recently. Very nice.
Yeah, they lived a good life.
Edelweiss. Cute.
These are Jules's nephews in Berlin.
Would you know about what year when you...
That's probably, I would say, 35,
Oh,
36.
what was interesting was talking about going to Berlin and doing this research and the reaction you had from there versus the research you did when you went to Italy.
Yeah, I was used to dealing with Italians, and they're not always that helpful, but they're really friendly, The Germans, not so much on either. Okay, fine.
Not helpful, not friendly.
No.
But you got something out of them.
But what we got was we went to all the places that Jules lived and worked, where he went to school when he was growing up. We went to all the neighborhoods, and I didn't know Berlin at all. It was the first time I'd ever been there. And so by the time we got to go, I already had a rough draft because of COVID. Everything was closed, so we couldn't go. And the minute Berlin opened, she had been waiting, and the minute it opened, she called me. She's like, we have to go. We need to get our tickets now. And it was really, she pushed me to go, and we went. And it made a world of difference because all of those details of his life, which is the main thrust of this book, we were able to see and touch and feel. And
when you walk around Berlin, every other building is gone or brand new. So much was destroyed, and every single one of my relatives' buildings were still there. So every address resulted in it was really incredible.
I've flipped onto this tiny detail in the book, and forgive me for being so superficial, but you discovered that Jules, when he came over to America in 1938, because he knew things were going bad, he bought a very expensive suit and a ticket to the Queen Mary, and tell us about that and why.
Yeah, he went first to find a sponsor in America. He needed someone to sign for him. It's called a financial sponsor, but they don't actually put up any money. It's just if the person who's coming over needs financial help, they'll be there instead of the government. So he needed to find somebody, and so he came to New York, and he wanted to appear to be a very wealthy man. So he bought a really nice suit, passage on the Queen Mary, and he stayed at a fancy hotel in Times Square, all to impress whoever he might meet and ask to sponsor him.
And then he had to go back. I'm forgetting when Faye stepped in. He had to go back because he didn't find one. Or what happened?
No, he a cousin of his, Faye Sternberg, she knew this gentleman named... That's her.
that's Faye and Murray.
Faye and Murray lived next door to Harry Donenfeld in the Bronx. Harry was a publisher of kind of dirty magazines, or what would be considered dirty magazines in the 20s and 30s. They were just scantily clad. And he was pretty successful, and he lived next door to Faye and
Murray.
So the beautiful thing about the story is that Cousin Faye prevailed upon Harry, and what I find really interesting is that years before, Harry had asked Faye and her husband to back him, a magazine?
He asked for a $400 investment in a new idea he had to do drawings with balloons above them.
Meaning comics.
Imagine that.
And so they didn't, and yet this
Murray
guy...
didn't have $400.
This guy, Harry, who we find out in the book is... What's the nice Yiddish word for? He's a crook, a ganef, right? A thief, right? Well, you'll hear more about him in a second. But,
and a mensch.
But the magical
And a mensch,
thing,
right. Wow and oi, they said in the Times Review.
Yeah, the Times Review said about him, wow and oi, and the name of the book is The American Way, and as we keep talking, you're going to start to hear filtering up how all of these threads and the American way is so much a part of this, and so this this guy who was a tough guy, you know, he said, yes, I will sponsor your cousin Jules. And that's why we have you.
Yeah.
So anyway,
and
then
20 other people.
tell us the great story about Jules going back in the border and how Clark Gable figured into that.
It's really nuts. So when he went back to Germany, he got there, he got off the he didn't take the Queen Mary back because he didn't need to impress anyone anymore. So he got off the boat when there was the table with the SS officers, and he approached them with his papers, and they said, why are you coming back? We don't want you here. Go. And his wife and my mother, his daughter, were there waiting for him to come back. And he said, I don't know how he did this so quickly, but he said, you don't understand, I'm Clark Gable's agent. He knew Hitler and Eva Braun loved Clark Gable and all his movies. So he said, if I don't get to Berlin, we will not have Clark Gable's next movie in Germany. And so they went off and discussed among themselves and decided they better let him in. So he got in, and then he got my mother and grandmother and more adventures.
And also, it's not by coincidence that they got out. Was it the day before Kristallnacht?
Day
Yes.
before, yeah.
They left Germany the day before Kristallnacht, Berlin.
And not a coincidence because why?
Well, and we learned this late in our process, but apparently a neighbor stopped Jules in the hallway of his apartment building, someone he just knew in passing, and he happened to be a member of the Gestapo. And the neighbor told him, listen, you got to get out of here, and you got to get out of here now. Not next week, now. And so they left.
And
Day before.
4 sisters, parents, in-laws, all perished after that. Now, I'm going to ask you to bear with me, and if you really want to be nice, you'll close your eyes for a second, because we got this out of order, and it's going to give away a big surprise. But of course, you don't have to. You're not children. But okay. This is Harry. You wouldn't want to get in his way, would you?
Those lapels.
Yeah. Sharp lapels, sharp mind, a real operator. So Harry, as we said, he had sponsored Jules, and he's got some pretty smutty magazines that are getting him in trouble, starting to get him in trouble with the government.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he was arrested twice.
Yeah.
And it was basically
He was
3
going to get
strikes
arrested
and you're
again.
out.
His third strike was coming up.
He's basically the godfather of this whole book, right?
Yeah.
So he's looking for something, you know, and so of course we all have to wonder, what the heck is Marilyn Monroe and Superman, in this case, what is Superman doing in this book? Well, there were a couple of Jewish nerds.
You got to go back.
This is Harry and Gussie, yeah.
There's Harry, his wife.
That's
that-
Gussie with George Reeves.
I have to go back now, right? Yeah. So there were a couple of these Jewish boys in Cleveland
There you go.
who were developing, tell us, Bonnie, about
Okay,
what they
well,
were developing.
You gonna start on this one? Okay, so Jerry and Joe lived in Cleveland.
Jerry Siegel and
Jerry
Joe-
Siegel and
Siegler.
Joe Shuster.
Siegel, yeah.
This is their first stab at a Superman comic, and Superman was evil. And they shopped it around, and they couldn't sell it anywhere. So they decided to go to the next one, to make Superman a good guy. So this was the next one that they made. And this they sent around to a lot of different companies, and they were rejected by everybody. And then Harry ended up calling somebody at another publishing company. He said, I got to fill this new magazine, Action Comics. Do you have anything lying around? And they sent this.
So the root of this, based on all your research, was really, it had something to do with a heroic alien and kind of
Jerry's-
fighting for the right. I mean, was it informed by Nazi Germany, or
I don't think it was like out and out informed. I think it was probably at the back of their minds. They were kids. I mean, they're seeing
Yeah.
what's going on over in Europe. They probably got relatives over in Europe. Their parents all immigrated, during the pogroms. And so they knew things were not good. but I think it was more subconscious, you know. And the people wanted a hero, right? What was going on in the 30s, it was not good. And they come up with this character. But it had been a long process. I mean, it took them like 5 years, really, to get to where they were going with it. And they chopped it around, and like she said, they got this opening at this new magazine called Action Comics, and they slapped this new guy on the cover, Superman.
And you say that like they kind of was it novel because this was a guy going out to fight for justice and help the poor, and there's housing, something about housing.
Yeah, he fought for all kinds of causes because, you know, Harry had been a communist, and, you know, he was
that
on the
capitalist
left.
had been a communist.
Yes. He had been a communist in the 20s. And so Superman fought for, you know, regular people's rights, basically. He would, you know, fight against corruption, and he would fight against labor issues and things like that. It was always something that he was fighting against. And one of the things he fought against was Hitler, before anybody else really started to talk about it, you know.
Jerry's father died when two guys came into...
Jerry being one of the authors of the book. There's a lot of characters in this, so I just want to keep you with us.
He
I
created
appreciate it.
Superman.
Jerry Siegel.
One of the Superman guys.
His father owned a clothing store. Two guys came in and tried to steal stuff, and his father had a heart attack and died. And that was huge in Jerry's life. So the idea that he came up with this guy who, you know, could take care of anybody, it makes a lot of sense for a young kid growing up without a father who wished he could have saved his own father.
And, you know, the motto, justice, truth, and the American way, shows up again, I mean, very much here. Just for the fun of it, Bonnie,
Do
what
this.
the heck?
Okay, so after my grandfather passed and we were just cleaning out his apartment, I found this car and I thought, that's adorable, I love it. So I brought it home and then discovered Action Comic.
She calls me one day, and she's on Zoom, and she's like, look what I just found. She shows me this car. She had it on her shelf for years, but she didn't realize the significance of it. You know, it's the exact same car that was on the cover. And so we're not sure how it came about. Maybe he saw it and knew it looked like that car, and we don't know. But it's just a crazy coincidence, one of many.
So more American Way stuff. These guys, I don't know how familiar you are, but they had a lousy time of it as the creators of Superman. They were not well treated by Shyster Harry at all, right? I don't know.
Yeah, they were treated terribly. It's referred to as the original sin in comics because they signed away the rights to Superman for $130, period. Yeah. And Harry and Jack Leibowitz, who also owned DC Comics, made, well, you can imagine.
So maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit with you about your ideas about the American way from any different aspects.
It works both ways, right? It's truth, justice, and the American way, the good way that we like to think of it. But it's also, the American way can also be bad, right? The American way during the war, or right before the war when Jews were trying to come over from Europe, was to stop as many as possible from coming, you know. Americans were pretty anti-Semitic, still were, and some of them still are now, as we know. So in a way, you know, stopping immigrants was the American way, you know, screwing people out of their money, even when it was legal. That's the American way, right? The corporate way. So it's got a lot of different levels. Did you want to?
Yeah. And America itself is both, you know, this amazing place that saved my family's lives and gave us a home and many other people. And, you know, I don't have to articulate all the terrible things we've done as well. And they're both very American.
And it's interesting. I mean, I think our first impulse when we hear the American way is to, it's a positive association. I think probably the sweetest and then most devastating, or another devastating story is the Marilyn Monroe thread in your book. And I mean, that's, oops, hi Harry.
There's Harry again.
Oh yeah, that's right, we're gonna skip through. Oh, well,
Wait,
we
go
could,
go back
yeah,
to that.
yeah.
George Reeves with Harry's grandchildren.
I don't think I've seen this picture.
Sweet.
Is that Amy?
Is Amy here?
Amy's here. Amy, stand up.
Oh,
Amy
Amy.
Donenfeld.
Raise
Amy
your hand.
Donenfeld.
So
And
cute.
the grandson.
And another grandson of Harry's is here too. Thank you, guys.
Palisades Park.
Oh.
George Reeves was doing an appearance in the middle of the summer. Superman, and the suit was wool, and it was really, really hot. And that poor guy was schwitzing like
Yeah.
18 tomorrow. But after
good.
he got cleaned up, he took a picture with us.
It's
And
very
you,
sweet.
Well, only because you're very attractive children.
You are.
It's a good picture. But, you know, I'm listening to this and I'm like, I'm so jealous that I don't have a family like yours, you know. Maybe I should reinvent it, you know.
They'll adopt you.
Okay.
I just love this picture. It was the DC Comics Christmas party in 1945. And if you go to the next slide, there's Harry and Gussie.
So the Marilyn Monroe connection, as far as I remember, is that she had been a model, right? She came from, as we all know, a really rough background and was modeling, and then came across Harry's purview, right? He
Yeah,
saw her.
what happened was, you know, we had the Marilyn component was obviously part of it because Jules had filmed her that night, right, in 1954. But the big puzzle to me, well, to both of us, was how are we going to connect Harry to Marilyn Monroe? Like, we've got the connection from Jules to Marilyn Monroe, but there's that gap there, right? So it was sort of at the back of my mind, and one day we're reading 1,000 books about Marilyn Monroe. I think there actually are literally 1,000 books about Marilyn Monroe. And at the very back of one of the books, I can't remember which one it was, sort of past, you know, the acknowledgments and everything, like very, very back, last page, is a candid photo of her from 1946 with nothing on but the covers of the magazines that she had posed in that year. She posed for 33 different covers that year, 33. She was a very, very hard worker, Marilyn Monroe. Amazing. That's different, but
Yeah, this is one of Harry's magazines that Marilyn was on the cover of. Before her name was Marilyn Monroe, she
Yeah.
was Jean Norman.
so
then.
she's covered in these magazines, and when I see the picture, at this point, I know Harry's magazines because I've been researching Harry for months. And when I see the magazines on her body, I realize they're Harry's magazines. And I almost passed out. Like, I called her immediately, you know, sent her a picture, and this is the missing link, you know. So she posed for Harry's magazines.
But we were talking earlier about, you know, oh, what an amazing coincidence. And yet, my thought is that you worked so hard, you know, you researched so diligently. This is how the magic happens. This is how things come up when you're thinking about, if you're thinking about writing or researching your family history. It's yeah, it was
You
a
just
great,
keep digging
great
and digging, yeah.
coincidence, but, you know, if you're digging away.
Yeah, like there's another one. An aunt gave me a book that Marilyn's stepsister wrote, and it wasn't very good, but I read it anyway, you know. And probably like 3/4 of the way through the book, she mentions that Marilyn would sew weights into the hemline of her maternity dresses, so they wouldn't blow up in the wind.
Well,
That's the only thing I used from that book, but it was like
yeah,
killer.
but
You know, that was
that's
like,
not what made her famous.
yeah, no, exactly. But it was it's just those little details that you
But
find.
it really is. You have to read 10 books to, you know, and each book might give you one nugget. It took a lot of time
And go through a lot of
work.
documents, too. Bonnie was
lot of
amazing with the
documents.
family research. You know, she did all the archival research and found out what happened to the family members that they never knew what happened to.
And I speak no German, so I typed it in letter by letter
But we
to
do have
Google Translate.
We have a German translator here, too. Ulrika, can you raise your hand, Ulrika?
So
Thank you, Ulrika.
Thank you, Ulrika.
Whenever we needed to know what something really said, we called Ulrika.
So, I think those are the balls that we have in the air, right? It only took us a half an hour to get through. It's great. But let's talk a little bit more about what you found in the rise of comic books, and talking about how maybe at one time they could teach, be more instructive or moral, or you're looking at me so quizzically, maybe we should just, next question.
I mean,
No, you had something to say about the comic books and...
well, yeah, like we said, I mean, Superman was sort of this, this hero for the working man, He was sort of solving problems. Like there's one issue of, I think it's either Action Comics or Superman, I don't remember, where he destroys a housing project, because it's bad or whatever. So it's sort of like, he was always like trying to make things better, and Harry grew up in tenements, and he, in the story, he basically destroys these tenements because it's a bad place for kids to grow up, you know what I mean?
He destroyed the tenements and then built gleaming new homes.
Right. Then he rebuilds something, obviously. He's not just leaving the rubble. But, he's always on the forefront of that social change, you know what I mean? And it wasn't until later, I guess in maybe the 50s, 60s, it started to become more conservative,
This one with Kennedy was unpublished, right?
Correct. Harry actually worked with the government. He made comics for the military because the soldiers would read comics and very little else. So the military asked him to make comics with these instructions for the soldiers. And this was one that was going to be published. And the reason I liked it and kept it in this is because it says, if I can't trust the President of the United States, who can I trust?
Right back to the beginning of the story.
Exactly. That's it.
I think I left the beautiful timeline you created backstage. Let's take a 30-second break.
We'll talk amongst ourselves. He's going to get the family tree, I think. I hope he finds it. Bonnie did this fabulous family tree when she was doing the research. I think he's trying to find it.
He wants to show it to you.
And I would call Bonnie every now and then. I'd lose it. I'm like, Bonnie, send me that family tree again. There's so many people involved in the story. When we first started researching it, we were going to follow one of the sisters of Jules through the story, but we couldn't find anything about her. And so we switched gears and started talking about his sister Golda, who wound up in 4 different concentration camps. And so you see her whole story in the middle of the book. And so she had this amazing family tree where she sketched it all out to show us who was who. So,
but it also showed the difficulty. His sister, who we couldn't find anything else about, was his favorite sister, the one he was closest to, and she left for Paris in 1937,
I think. Right after, before he got married.
Yeah, in 34.
34.
So she went to Paris, and she worked in an orphanage for Jewish children. I'm literally telling you everything we know about her. She worked in an orphanage for Jewish children, and she was shot to death on the street. And that's all we know.
We couldn't
and
find
we
anything
hired
else.
someone in France to try and help us during COVID, to try and help find out more. We can't find her or her husband anywhere. So
Maybe
that's an
the next
ongoing
book.
investigation.
Yeah, we'll do that one next. But
I'm going to take us back to Jules now, because I wanted to talk to you about the camera, the Bolex that he had. I mean, one of the interesting things in reading about his life on the Upper East Side is that was a very German neighborhood that he lived in, right? Yorkville?
Yes.
yeah,
Germantown.
Germantown on the Upper East Side.
Tell us a little bit about that, like being in Germantown in the 40s, right?
It's kind of interesting. Like when he first came to look at New York, when he was going to hopefully move here, I don't think he told anybody he was Jewish, because he was going to live up there on the Upper East Side, and it was all Germans, And they actually had a parade. The German Bund had a parade, right around the corner from him as late as 1939, a Nazi parade on the Upper East Side, okay? Some of you probably know they had a big rally at Madison Square Garden around the same time. And so, when he first moved there, I think they probably didn't, maybe advertise so much that they were Jewish. But then once the war started, it all turned around, the war in America. And the Germans,
They didn't look so good anymore.
they stopped speaking German. And yeah.
Did they stop? They stopped calling their food certain things too, right?
Oh, it was Liberty cabbage instead of sauerkraut,
Yeah,
right?
Liberty cabbage. They're like freedom fries,
So he's, your grandpa is up on the Upper East Side. He's got a good fur business, right? And you describe this man who just makes me smile because of his enthusiasm.
Yeah.
And the camera seemed a big part of it, and it's obviously what inspired the whole book.
Yeah, he really loved to document. I mean, he was so grateful to have made it here and to be alive with his family. And so he documented every moment was precious and needed to be kept. He filmed my mother and her sister walking to school, but like he directed them. So they were walking up in front of Bloomingdale's on Lexington Avenue, and then he'd shoot the street sign, so you knew it was like 61st Street, 62nd Street,
establishing
63rd
shot,
Street, in between the shots of them with their books.
Well, he went and edited those, right?
He could have been in
Yeah.
camera, but he did edit a lot. There are a lot of splices in his films.
So you did marry a beautiful animating film director.
I did.
Filmmaker.
No coincidence.
Okay, we won't discuss that here.
Hi, honey.
But, the enthusiasm of somebody with this camera, it just seems to me that this is very American way, in a way. And also, one of these guys that we all would love to meet because he's present, right? He's there to appreciate the moment. And you didn't get much sense of that as a child when we talked about it because you knew him for 26 years. He took care of your grandmother who had had a stroke.
Yes. After my grandmother had the stroke, he was her 100% caretaker all the time. So I didn't have like one-on-one time, like we didn't go to a Broadway show together or anything, because really my grandmother was his full responsibility, and that's where his attention went. But we went to their house every Sunday, their apartment. So we did see him a lot.
And he was just a great guy. I mean, not just to Edith, but he was the mayor of the block. If you live in New York, you know what that is.
He was head of the 61st Street Block Association?
Yeah, he was, he was the guy in the neighborhood that you went to if you had a problem, He was constantly on call for the older people in the neighborhood. If they had problems, they would call him.
He would go pick up pills for people. He would help them get into their apartment if they locked out. He was just available.
He would call and remind them about their doctor's appointments. He was that guy, He was this great, great guy. And he was honored, at dinners in the neighborhood because people loved him so much.
And one of the themes in the book is also that some superheroes wear capes and some superheroes don't wear capes. And Opie, which is what we call him, was a superhero without a cape.
It's, I guess, somewhat ironic that after all those years in his happy home, a very good-natured foundation
Yes, a good foundation, really. The Mellon Foundation
ran him out.
bought the townhouse and evicted him when he was 93 years old.
The American way?
It was crazy.
He died right after it, 6 months later, after he moved.
We fought it for a year, and I mean they were doing construction. We ended up getting a place for him across the park, and he died 6 months after moving into the new place.
And yet, if I may be so optimistic as an American, isn't it in that time that you discovered the films?
We discovered the films moving him out, yes. I was really grateful that they weren't just thrown away. I mean, picture a D'Agostino's bag. Like when you're cleaning apartments, that's a first thing to go. So we were first grateful that we found it and saved it.
But it was, it's amidst all these other films of her family, all the people who escaped from Nazi Germany and, bar mitzvahs and weddings and, the day-to-day stuff of life. Marilyn was kind of thrown in the middle of all that. So and that's kind of the book,
So now, Bonnie, I'm going to allow you to describe the moment of seeing this in your after you got the stuff, bags and strips of film? Well, you tell them, and Jeff helping you.
Okay, so we were there, and we found this bag, and we knew it was full of this 60mm film. So we brought it home, and my husband is an animator, and he put it up on the reel-to-reel. But like I said, we could see just by holding it up to the light that white dress. So we were really just. My husband screamed, I think, and then I came running. It was just magical, and we were too afraid. We were afraid to run it through the projector because of the splices. So for a long time, we just looked at it with a loop.
And then what you called your grandfather.
Oh yes, and I called my grandfather and I said, "Opie, we found the Marilyn film. It's incredible." And he said, "Of course you did." Like he never doubted that it existed or it was there. He knew he shot it. So he was just like, yeah, so?
It's just something so magical about, and we all, I think, have, well, if we're lucky enough to have lore in our family, some story that we don't really know how to prove, right?
Yeah, that's what all of this was. I knew the barest details of each of these stories, just, what I had heard over and over. But then we called, like, almost all my family, well, every relative that I knew of. And that included Faye's grandchildren, who I didn't know of, even though they're my cousins, and now we're good friends. My parents didn't have brothers and sisters, so I actually have no first cousins. But through doing this book, I have like 100 new cousins. It's really exciting.
Yeah, and the lesson is to talk to your relatives, especially your older relatives, now. Like, as soon as you leave here, go call them, because
there were people, some of the people in the book who we wrote about were people I celebrated Passover and Thanksgiving with and never knew their stories, and now they're no longer with us, and that's a shanda.
So, what surprised you in all this?
There were a million things that surprised me, but something that really stood out. Most of the stuff about the Holocaust I found, even though I had read a lot and seen a lot, like, one thing was the Jews had to pay to clean up after Kristallnacht, and they had to pay for their Jewish stars that they had to wear. I know it's a tiny thing that's meaningless, but it really took my breath away. Wait, what's the other one?
Helene,
I know, and the other one was that Auschwitz was the only camp that tattooed prisoners. I thought that was a universal thing, but apparently 4 prisoners broke into a storage room, stole Nazi uniforms, got in a car, and drove out of the camp. And so after that, they were like, well, we got to be able to check them somehow. So it's only Auschwitz. I was shocked.
Any surprises
There were
for you?
two things. Similarly, I knew a little bit about the Holocaust. She knew more than I did. But just the pure, horrible evil of the Nazis just stunned me day after day after day. Every time I thought it was going to be as bad as it got, it got worse the next day, on the next dive, And the beautiful thing about this book is that we had 3 different topics. We had Superman, Marilyn Monroe, and the Nazis. So whenever I couldn't take it anymore with the Nazis, I would switch gears and, read about Marilyn, because I was going to lose my mind. It was so horrible. And this is over COVID. Everybody's depressed to begin with. And then the Marilyn stuff, I didn't know anything about Marilyn Monroe, really. I was shocked at how awesome she was.
We both fell in love with her.
I feel bad that I was such a jerk before about Marilyn. I totally thought she was a bubblehead and, some stupid blonde, and she was not. She was so smart, and she was so on it, and she was completely responsible for her success. And, it didn't work out in the end for her, but she paved the way for all of us. She was a really, really strong woman. She was sexual and not afraid of it. There was nothing wrong with being naked as far as she was concerned. And, it just wasn't accepted in the 50s. It was a shocker,
So the commonality is chutzpah with all these
Chutzpah,
characters, right?
that's right. And she became a Jew. She,
There you go. There's another thread.
she converted when she married Arthur Miller. So.
So kind of last question, and then you're just going to read the beautiful last paragraph or so. But what do you hope this book will do?
Well, I want everybody to read it, first of all. But I think, you've got a lot of different threads in there, and we've tied them all together. But I think the main message, and this is through Jules, is to love each other. That's what Jules did. He loved everybody. And he was this wonderful, wonderful guy. Like she said, sort of a superhero without a cape. And that's the message for the book. That's always the message for me. You got to love each other and stop hating each other.
Which includes opening borders, or you were talking a little bit
No,
about
and
that.
taking care of each other also. I mean, that's what he did. He really reached out to help people, unsolicited, and
Yeah.
he was just so generous of his heart and spirit.
When new refugees came to town, he would invite them over for dinner. He would have parties for them. They'd have a wedding. He would host the wedding for them. For refugees he did not know. We're not talking about his relatives. We're talking about people who just arrived in New York.
It's about being open and welcoming.
Yeah.
Is what it is.
And just loving people. Yeah,
So we're going to just share a little tiny snippet. It's a beautifully written book.
Thank you.
The level of love comes through, and the excitement.
Okay, we're just going to round it out here. Bring it back.
Bring it
back
back.
around.
Bring us back.
For a minute and a half, Marilyn moves and breathes.
Oh, I'm sorry, one thing. I just wanted to introduce, we're back to this footage, but what is described in advance is that this is on a clip, and there's a little bit of Marilyn Monroe, and then there's an unknown relative on the grass that gets thrown into the same strip, and then there's a Shriners Parade. It's like Jules being excited by life and by America. And it's all in there. And then
The rich
on
pageant
the film,
that is
on the film
America.
we get here.
So here we go. For a minute and a half, Marilyn moves and breathes and is alive again. Not on television or up on a wide screen, but in a home movie that hardly anyone has ever seen. The American Dream in flesh and blood. She holds a red and white striped scarf in one hand and a white clutch in the other, and tries to hold down the famous white pleated dress. It billows up like a paratrooper's parachute, like those parachutes she sprayed and inspected so long ago at the radio plane factory, just before she started modeling. Back when World War II was still raging, the concentration camps about to be discovered by the American and Russian GIs. Marilyn yawns, Marilyn smiles, Marilyn glows. Her skin is just like Billy Wilder described it decades ago, flesh that photographs like flesh. You feel you can reach out and touch it, hold it, squeeze it. For a moment, the film crew crowds in and Jules shoots through a gap between their bodies. He captures only Marilyn's face, which looks off to the left, serious and unsmiling. Joe DiMaggio is there in the crowd, though you can't see him, but Marilyn can, and she watches him walk away.
Tom Ewell comes into the shot, and Marilyn pushes him into place. Wilder, dressed in his winter coat and fedora, moves in and out of the shot. Marilyn's dress flutters as she holds it down and chats with Ewell, but it flutters up again, and she laughs, throwing her head back. The dress flies clear up over her head, revealing the two pairs of white, silky underpants and the dark patch that they have failed to camouflage. The skirt hovers behind her like angel's wings, and for a second, it looks like she may just fly up, up, up and away over the metropolis rooftops and the screaming, leering crowd that we cannot see or hear. Then, as suddenly as she appeared, Marilyn is gone. The dream is over. 3 seconds of black is followed by a single frame from a home movie. A middle-aged Schulbach relative strolls on green grass, a teenage boy behind her, both on a typical, miraculous family outing. A family that, had it not been for Harry or Faye or America, would simply not exist.
Thank you.
Thank you.
They'll sign your books outside. Thanks again.
And we'll sign them.